Hi, I'm Tina Desiree Berg reporting for Status Coup News. This week on the Rightwing Insanity Report, I am bringing in a guest, Eddie Kim. He writes for Mel magazine based out of San Francisco currently, but you've also seen his work in The Guardian, Vice News, and other areas. He writes about right-wing extremism, obviously from an Asian point of view. So we're going to talk today about not only the increase in Asian hate crimes at the hands of right-wing extremists, but also the fact there is right-wing extremism that exists within the community. So welcome, Eddie.
Tina, thank you very much for having me.
Yes, very excited to have this conversation. This is one area of right-wing extremism that just doesn't seem to be getting a lot of attention, and I think it should be. We've been seeing massive increases in hate crimes against the Asian community for the last 3 years running. I wanted to put up this article to show you 2021, the explosion we had. We don't have the data yet for 2022. It's, January, the first week of January, so they haven't released that yet. But I think given what I've been seeing this year, it won't be shocking to have another increase. But the number of hate crimes in California rose for the third year in a row in 2021 and included a sizable uptick in the number of anti-Asian crimes, according to a report from the Attorney General. The California Department of Justice released its annual report on hate crimes on Tuesday morning, noting 1,763 reported hate crimes, up from 33% the year prior, which is, I think a lot of people thought that when Trump was gone, this stuff would kind of tamp down, and it hasn't. Hate against Asian Americans saw another year of triple-digit percentage increases, with crimes increasing 177.5%. So I wanted to, talk with you a little bit about this. I don't think it's abating yet, and I think it was originally being driven by COVID. Trump called it the Chinese flu, the Asian flu. It just sort of started this chain reaction snowball where people were blaming lockdowns, just having the disease itself on the Asian community, which is completely unfounded. But I think that started the ball rolling. But I also don't think it's the only thing influencing that. What is your perspective?
Well, it's so strange because, obviously I've been talking to my parents about this. They actually moved in retirement back to South Korea last year. Right. And one of the last conversations I had with them was about the need for me to stay safe doing the work that I do, being out at protests and things like that. But also the feeling like the hens had come home to roost, as my dad kind of put it, in the sense that I think for a lot of Asian people in this country, there is a sentiment that we are an invisible minority, not vilified in quite the same way as the Black and Latino communities, but still subject to a lot of harassment and a lot of violence. And there's been a lot of academia and reportage on exactly why that's persisted for so long since the immigration waves of the 1970s till now. And it really is a moment where I think with the increased visibility around Asian people and Asian Americans specifically, with Trump's sort of declaration around the China virus and sort of the right-wing acceptance of that rhetoric. But I think it also made us visible in the sense that in some statistical ways, certain groups of Asian Americans are excelling in America right now, in terms of the arguments about college admissions and affirmative action. A lot of Asians are on the side of, hey, we are high achieving, we have demonstrated something, we are perhaps the model minority. And I really push back against that rhetoric, the model minority myth, and how harmful it is and how it flattens Asian Americans, which is such a 2D term to begin with, into sort of a singular body. When in fact, Asian Americans is a demographic that has some of the fastest rising wealth inequality in all of America, right? But I think that increased visibility made Asian Americans more of a threat. It made them seem even more other than before. And it's not just because of the COVID relationship, but I think decades of our communities expanding, gaining some generational wealth in some demographics, and otherwise becoming a little bit more visible, a little bit more visible, a little bit more visible. And it made me think about this 2020 paper that I just read in the journal Criminology. And it basically looks at how hate crimes come from inspirations around political threat and emboldenment of people who are opposed to certain kinds of change, progressivism, and certainly growth in minority communities. And I found it fascinating that, Immediately after emancipation in 1865, the Ku Klux Klan formed as a means to preserve white supremacy, right? And when members of the Black community gained economic status in various U.S. cities through the middle of the century, the communal backlash against them from white America and extremists was very, very severe. And so I think in moments of visibility and legitimacy, hey, Asian Americans are a part of America, Asian immigrants are a part of America and will continue to be, it just made the threat seem so much more clear. And I think that is continuing to persist. And it's just one in sort of a rainbow of different right-wing things, subjects that they believe are battlegrounds. And that also includes LGBTQ spaces, drag expression. It also involves myths around Black criminality and violence. It's all the same stuff. And they're sitting at this buffet right now saying, what's going to stick today? What's going to stick today? And unfortunately, as we've seen from these hate crime numbers, Asian American targets have just been
exploded.
That much more obvious. Yeah, that much more clear.
And I wonder, you mentioned higher education, and I think that is an interesting conversation to have right now, because there is a backlash to the admittance numbers of Asian Americans in Ivy League schools, public Ivy League schools and whatnot. And do you think that maybe the jealousy surrounding that, or the anger surrounding that, is real? Because now you've got maybe some white guys that have not applied themselves in the same ways an Asian American student might have, right? Didn't do quite as much homework to get all the A's in AP classes, didn't maybe do well on the SAT, whatever. But instead of really taking a look at themselves, they're going to blame the fact that there's a lot of Asian Americans that did do that work and were admitted, into these universities. And I have to say, when I was at UC Irvine, I was kind of turned off a lot by some of the rhetoric that even existed then. They would call UCI the University of Chinese Immigrants. Like, it was a thing that the white dudes would say. And I would be like, wow, really? I'm like, you're just pissed because you guys, don't rule the roost anymore, so to speak. And when we got rid of, let me say this, when we got rid of affirmative action, it had the opposite effect. All of these guys were convinced that that's why these students were getting in to the university or UC, right? Turns out that wasn't the case. And then even fewer white dudes were admitted. Like, the numbers of women that got increased as well. So oopsie on that. But what are your thoughts on that?
It's a good point, and it's something that I'm trying to parse out right now. I'm writing a long essay on meritocracy and higher education, and simply the fact that, listen, the vast majority of Asian people who go to higher education in this country do not go to Ivy Leagues. They do not go to prestigious schools. The vast majority of Ivy League seats go to white people who have legacy. Who have athletics, who have other forms of merit, which often in this country that means daddy or mommy paid a lot of big bucks to a school. And so so number one, yes, Tina, I absolutely have heard the bitterness, the sort of jealousy around Asian achievement in academia, the typical digs about, they have no personalities, they're just good at studying. In fact, that's what Harvard University, this lawsuit against them right now, that's what they're trying to parse out with the Supreme Court, is that, why is there such a huge gap between what teachers and cohorts say about a student, not just academically, but in terms of their personality and their generosity, whatever, their character traits. And why are Harvard admissions people saying, oh, these Asian kids are kind of boring and they're flat and their grades might be good, but they're scoring low on things like curiosity and courage,
which is
I believe,
nuts. That is, oh my God. Yeah, I saw that. It's crazy.
Right. And so now we see it once again, how the idea of a model minority myth cuts both ways, right? You can't have it both ways, and yet that's exactly how the rhetoric spreads. Either people are doing too well, and that's why literally it's a white man who is leading the charge on this affirmative action lawsuit with the Supreme Court, has for a very long time, but has gotten a coterie of Asian voices and supporters who are also believing that this excellence is inherent and needs to be protected in some way. I think if you look further into the research, it's so much more complicated than that.
Of course,
Even just the fact that, here in San Francisco, there's huge controversy over a prestigious public school named Lowell, and it has a disproportionately high Asian population. And honestly, research is starting to show that in environments like that, if you put anybody, including a student who is struggling, into that environment with better resources, cohorts and peers who are more engaged, et cetera, turns out that their achievement increases. And so it's just a very complicated swirl of identity politics and sort of social pride too, right? Like, I was taught that I needed to be studious because that was going to be my way of like making it in the world. I don't know, at 32, whether that's panned out exactly the way I envisioned at 17, but nonetheless, this is something that also comes from within our own homes.
That's right.
And our
it's
own
culture.
cultures.
But it's not just Asian cultures that view education that way. A lot of the Scandinavian countries do too, but nobody wants to talk about the way Finland perceives its education system.
No, nobody wants to talk about Nigerian excellence in American higher ed.
Cuban even.
Yes, that's right. The list goes on.
Yeah.
But to kind of circle back, I think this is why it's so interesting to wonder, why does white America look at Asians as a threat? And when do we not appear as a threat? Because I've also written about the sort of biases and racism within like the dating pool, online dating pools and sexual culture. Asian men routinely rank the lowest among all groups racially in terms of attractiveness in that online setting. So there's a lot going on. And I think what has been very good to see is that in one way or another, Asian families, Asian couples, Asian communities are talking about this and thinking about this explicitly. And unfortunately, I think for all the good that does, it also leads some people down the rabbit hole. Down the rabbit hole of saying, why is society like this? How do I fix it? And I think that's where a lot of certainly right-wing extremists stand and how they see themselves in the mirror. And that includes Asian extremists who are right-wing. I think something that is not very much discussed in this country, and I'm mulling a magazine story on it, is what Asian conservatism looks like, what Asian reactionaries sound like. And I think that is a really sort of untapped world.
I agree.
That has, again, very deep roots in America and sort of original waves of immigration here.
In fact, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, I want to talk about an article you wrote in Mel Magazine in regards to the way the right-wing extremists fantasize about Asian women, because I think this is pertinent to the conversation as well. But yeah, right-wing extremists within the Asian community absolutely exist. I have interviewed several of them, including one that was a sovereign citizen. And that is an incredibly extreme anti-government viewpoint, right-wing militia, like I don't believe in paying taxes kind of viewpoint. So any community is not going to be monolithic, right? There's going to be an expansion of beliefs politically and otherwise within the community. And I just think people struggle with when they look at a community that they're not a member of, it's just more easy and convenient for them if they can put it into a box, which is never the right thing to do, because you're going to lead yourself down all kinds of wrong pathways. You published a piece I want to put up for a second here, because I thought this was a really good lens with which to discuss this particular subject material. Asian women have always been a deadly obsession of white men. And, I think that this is definitely true. We can see it not only with the stereotype, right, but just in the real world. You're opening this piece talking about the guy that committed this horrible mass shooting of several spas. He fetishized and otherwise scapegoated for a pandemic abused behind closed doors, even gunned down. Asian hatred is a designed piece of the American experiment. Yeah. So at some point on Tuesday, March 15th, a 21-year-old with a Richard Spencer haircut, which is that very fascist haircut, and a scraggly red beard walked into Big Woods Goods in Canton, Georgia, and bought a 9mm pistol. He planned on driving to more spas and massage parlors in Florida, but for now, the motive is officially unclear. There's no end to the chatter on Chan boards, meaning 8chan, 4chan, Reddit and Twitter about why Robert Aaron Long chose spas that were allegedly Asian owned. Was it a racist hate crime? Was he more of a misogynist? Was it a religious fervor based on his Baptist beliefs? I'm guessing it's probably a little bit of all of that, but walk us through your thoughts on this.
You know, in that next paragraph, I basically say maybe a motive is almost beyond the point, because again and again, we've seen young and middle-aged and older white male shooters, killers, choose to go out in the sort of the trope of a blaze of glory. And even if they have manifestos, even if they have online Reddit posts, even if they have sort of a journal that seems to explain what happened, I mean, often violent expression is just the last thing someone thinks about. It's effectively suicide. And so it's confusing. And instead of it being like, oh, like Trump talked about COVID and that's what inspired this guy to go out, I think it's so much more complicated than that. I think it is an example of how there is great harm in a lack of representation and a lack of humanization of minority people in this country. And so when somebody like that gentleman goes into a fury and goes into their own radicalized spiral, and they need to get it out, they need to get that feeling out, they're going to look to people that they think, oh, there will be others who are on my side, at least. You know, it may be less of a pointed, I'm going to look for an Asian person and do it. Although, of course, that happens. I don't want to downplay explicit acts of Asian targeting.
Right.
But sometimes I think it's just that society has painted people in a way that makes them seem less important, less human, and more symbolic rather than an individual of flesh and bone. And I think, you know, I kept thinking about that while writing that piece. Maybe that's me trying to downplay some of the human horror of all of this. But I think the genuine reality and why it's not easy to fix this through conventional means like policing and criminal justice is because this is the result of decades and decades and decades of political and social pressure that makes certain people feel under attack. Now, if you really look hard, the people under attack are Muslims, are undocumented Latina people, are undocumented Asian people, are poor Asian people. But I think the narrative has made it such where, you know, we talk a lot about the great replacement theory among white extremists and white conservatives. I think this is an expression of that fear, of that tension. And so, it is obvious that he bought a gun and was looking for the right target. The right target happened to be Asian women. And when you look back decades and decades into the 1800s, into even the 1700s, you see that Asian women have been fetishized as both
docile.
And they've both been portrayed positively and negatively within that trope in American culture and film, etc. And so when somebody thinks of who can I kill and get away with it, maybe that's what plays into this sort of invisibility of the real humanity of the community. I certainly, other minority communities know exactly what this is like when they are targeted as a result of white fear. And that's exactly why, you know, Tulsa burned down. Right. You know, that was Black Wall Street. And that's not a coincidence. But it's also not as easy as saying, oh, people planned on just destroying the Black economic sort of market and that's their goal and they pulled it off. No, there's so much more behind it.
There is so much more behind it. I wanted to switch gears and talk about right-wing extremism within the Asian community. I think this is a really important part of the conversation, too. I think a lot of people on the outside that don't pay attention to these movements are often shocked to discover that there are, you know, quote-unquote white nationalists that are not white. And it's a thing everywhere, not just within the Asian community, but also within the Hispanic community, the Black community, you name it. It exists. You know, it's sort of predicated, I think, as roots in just fascist nationalist ideals to begin with, and it just grows from there. I think what's unique about the interior of the Asian community is it's often perceived on the outside as the closest proximity to white.
Yeah.
And I want to highlight for a minute that a lot of the old school nationalists, right, and also race scientists, race-based scientists that want to talk about race being real and attributes being assigned to race, right? A lot of them have had to grapple with Asian data on IQ and a whole host of other things because it doesn't fit neatly into there's a hierarchy and white people are at the top, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very messy conversation. I want to pull up an article that I thought, this is from the Global Network for Extremism, so they do a lot of reporting on and research in this area, where they're talking about, I'm going to scroll down to this one paragraph. Oopsie, hang on. Just lost my mouse. There we go. That really kind of gets to the crux of this. So it is crucial to recognize that far-right, alt-right, or even red pill movements that exist in Southeast Asia are just as heterogeneous and diverse as the people living in the region. Yeah. As part of this, the extremist ideology adopted by the 2 detainees in Singapore should not be interpreted as an unprecedented phenomena in Southeast Asia, but one that has existed for some time and has been generally accepted. The general hostility towards communism and socialism, and I think this is part of the conversation right there, mainly amongst the Asian 5 countries, can make it difficult to treat far-right and alt-right ideas as potential problems, especially when many of the concepts were borrowed from recent Western far-right thoughts to be reshaped and localized for mainstream appeal. Although it is tempting to conclude that both youths and adopted Western-style far-right extremism in response to Islamicist extremism, I can't get that out, this is only a superficial interpretation. It is necessary to dive deeper into the ongoing politics of othering, be it Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, or any other Southeast Asian state. Existing far-right movements in various states share ethno-religious aspirations to preserve the purity of their respective nations, separate from the presence of other religions or ethnicities that are not considered to have a legitimate claim in the state. And I think also, getting rid of globalism in general that they feel has been very problematic for the country. I think Malaysia, you could look at that for. So what is your take on that? Do you think that's sort of a good lens to view these things from as a starting point? What are your thoughts?
It's a big lens. One of the core questions that example makes me think about, and that article, which is excellent, makes me think about is, how do modern eras of political and cultural division, and especially economic inequality, how do they lead to extremist violence as counterculture? And what picture of the past exists to inspire the reactionary ideas today? Yeah. And when you think about things like national purity, what I really think about is things used to be better when things were simpler and things were more stable. Yeah. And we can blame cultural heterogeneity as the thing. A lot of people, including in the West, fetishize, well, especially Western far-right extremists, often fetishize places like Japan and South Korea, which are very homogeneous nations, and they believe that creates stability. But that's ironic because when you talk about Asian reactionaries and Asian far right, I mean, South Korea, I wrote about this for Mel extensively. They voted in their sort of de facto Trump figure. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol ran on sort of young male discontent. He ran on talking points that were anti-feminist, that were anti-communist, that were basically kind of from the buffet table that we see Western extremists pull from in terms of political rhetoric. I'm not saying it's the exact same situation. America is a very, very different country. But I think that's a good example of how, things are not always what they seem. And I want to bring that back home to the US, to the point I made earlier, that Asian conservatism is a powerful force. On my TikTok thread right now, or FYP right now, I can see memes about young Asian people saying, there go my parents saying something toxic or cancelable again, because this exists in our communities. Racism, classism, colorism exists in the
That's huge,
Asian
actually.
Community.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, exactly. And that goes back to what I said about how Asian Americans as a demographic have some of the worst wealth inequality in the last 25 years. And it's because we're not we're sort of grouping everyone together. But to that point, I think there is even a huge phenomenon of young Asian Americans in this country and people on social media spaces talking about very like racist, white supremacist talking points like, hey, what the media won't talk about is all these hate crimes are done by Black people. And like, if only common sense policing would come back, we could lock up all these Black violent people, then, we could save our Asian elders from being assaulted. And of course, there's no real, within those thought circles, there's not real interrogation of why there's a higher rate of Black crime in this country. It's the, the black on white violence debate all over again, just with an Asian lens. And so
that's kind of disturbing, but yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yes. I mean, there are Asian social media accounts that just put up footage of Black people assaulting Asian people and say, this is what the media won't show you. It's very like 1994, cable news sort of.
Yeah, it feels very 1994 post Rodney King civil unrest to me. That they try to, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, we can have that conversation. That's where this term roof Korean comes from, right?
Yes. Oh, I actually had that in my notes. I'm glad you mentioned that. Like and similarly in white extremist circles, especially online in terms of social media and memes, rooftop Korean from the LA riots, the images of folks standing on their business roofs with shotguns and rifles and handguns, defending against sort of this faceless imagined horde of Black and brown people. I mean, it's a horrible thing that happened. I wrote an article about why rooftop Koreans have become such a powerful meme for Second Amendment sort of Proud Boy types. And
it's weird. All these decades later, this all of a sudden has become a thing. And I've had kids ask me, like, what is the root of that? And I'm like, 1992, like when I was in college. Like, it's weird.
And honestly, it feels a lot like, let's boil it down. Look at this model minority doing what nobody else had the guts to do, which is shoot guns at Black and brown people who are trying to take their stuff. Yeah, it's a tokenizing process. Now, I have family members who lived through that experience, for real. And it's not a cool thing that they want to make like fascist memes about. It was like a horribly traumatic experience and a wake-up call. And I think certainly it left some Asian people with a bitter taste in their mouths about their fellow minority communities and feeling victimized by that. I think you can't really help it when
of course you can't.
The way it does. But,
I also think, can I just interject this right here? I think the thing that still sticks with me to this day, I mean, I was like 22 or something when this happened, but Daryl Gates, our then police chief, who was an incredibly racist individual, like horrifyingly racist, was at a fundraiser ignoring what happened, and his instruction had gone out to the LAPD to just not intervene. So really, this is a racist white dude basically telling two different minority groups that I don't give a shit what you do to each other, burn down your businesses, go after each other, whatever. It's not my problem. It's not, as long as you don't come into the white wealthy neighborhoods, it's fine. I mean, that's sort of the messaging that he was putting out. And I know that, at the time, several LAPD officers were like, why can't we go? People need help. This is insane. Why is he preventing us? Why are we in this parking lot for hours and hours just standing here? I mean, there were so many messed up things from that happened. And I think to come forward 25 years later and decide that this is a good thing to create a meme over is just really off-putting on so many levels.
It's super, super off-putting, but I'm not at all surprised, right? I mean, I think so much of modern right-wing expression is sort of couched in irony and layers of sort of sarcastic support. When I think about how the Proud Boys sort of appropriated the Swahili term for freedom as their like rallying cry.
Yeah, uharu, right?
It's just, you see the jokes kind of writing themselves for that community. And I think it's the same thing. Now, what I think the real harm is when this rhetoric, which is so infused with this regressive idolization of an America that once was, and sort of subliminal and often explicit ideas about white supremacy, and how there is a hierarchy in America, and why Asians being closer to that white hegemony is actually a good thing. I think all those feelings have led to pushing actual Asian people into extremist circles. I mean,
okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we know the phenomenon of groups like Latinos for Trump or whatever. We know about how Cuban conservatism has led to a lot of political division and support for right-wing candidates from brown people in places like Florida. We know about that. But I think also now what we're seeing is a rising movement of Asian reactionary thought. And that I think is what pushes a guy like Tony Moon out onto the streets, quote unquote, the rooftop Korean, who's out and about in Los Angeles, going to rallies, trying to weaponize water bottles to smack people over the head with, and running with a group who claim to be pulling security and want to be leaders on the front lines. I mean, in some ways, to the Asian stereotype, that's so radical. Like,
it's incredibly radical, right?
That. Yeah, we are not supposed to be doing that. But it's, and I guess the counterpoint.
And you're right; it is incredibly reactionary. It
is, because to me, I almost think of what I heard from some of my elder family members who had immigrated to America, talking about, oh, America is the best, America is like, you want to move into a nice white rich neighborhood, you want to make your money, like you want to put your head down. It's a lot of those attitudes I think have evolved, and it's evolved with that bitterness that I was talking about a lack of visible human representation, and really the Asian community not being seen as a monolith. And so I think that's very inspiring to folks who want to join militias and front lines and really cause a splash.
So they're pushing back against that stereotype of like, no, we're not all the same. Like, you think just because I'm Asian, I think this. Yeah, I totally see that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, there's a lot of psychoanalysis around why would someone want to be a token member of a community? Hey, maybe that comes into it too. But I really think that it is an evolution of conservative thought that existed in Asian, especially East Asian communities, and that's my experience being Korean, evolving into something new, just like it has for other parts of American society. 25 years ago, we couldn't have imagined the insurrection. When it happened, for me, it was the most obvious thing that could happen.
Exactly. It was like, yes, of course that happened. Anybody that had been paying attention to these groups were like, that happened.
So this is a good point about how the movement of the Overton window, or the normalization of certain forms of politics, how that movement toward the right affects all people. Victims, yes, to go back to the start of our conversation, victims, absolutely, but also inspiring new members of extremist groups. And if I'm going to be fair, I would also say that there's a lot of energy among young Asian people to become anarchists, to become a part of Antifa sort of circles, to serve as the extremist front line in defense of things that
they see as fascist. And
100%. In protection of things that they feel is important. So, not to both sides this, but to say that this energy and context is leading people into new territory, I believe is actually really, really true.
I think it's definitely true. I think back, there's a LA Proud Boy who is Asian. I believe he's from Vietnam, but I'm not 100% sure. But, I had this conversation with him one day. This was about 3-4 years ago, actually. And I've never been able to let go of it because it was really a stunning conversation for me, what he said. He was being frank. And he told me that when he moved to this country, when his parents moved to this country, not him, he was not here yet. When his parents moved to this country, they were sponsored by Holocaust survivors. And so I thought to myself, and I said to him quite frankly, I said, so then how can you do what you do now? I really want you to explain this to me. And then he said, well, Nazis don't exist anymore. And I'm like, Nazis don't exist anymore, but they do. And he's like, no, they don't. Nazis died out in 1943. And I'm like, that's a ridiculous way to reframe this conversation. You're basically trying to say if you're not associated directly with World War II Germany, that ideology has no place. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. Of course it does. And then I went to his Facebook profile page. And do you recall when Bernie Sanders did that rally? And I believe it was Arizona, and a group of guys threw a swastika over the side of the railing in the middle of the speech. So he had a photo of that on his Facebook page with a giant circle around it. And then in the conversation was a bunch of PYOB. I knew it was you guys, hearts, like, so the whole 9 yards. So that's stunning to me, right? You came to this country because of Holocaust survivors, but yet here you are siding with folks that would see Jewish people not exist, more or less. How do you square that circle? It's a wild thing because it is deeply reactionary. And I think it's rooted in, I really do think, and Eddie, and I'd like to know your thoughts on this too. I think a lot of it's deeply rooted in anti-communism, right? Whether that's real or not doesn't matter. The American perception of what communism is, right? Yeah. Reactionary to that.
Yeah. The anti-communism movement, if you will, maybe just rhetoric, and the anti-sort of communist party of China sort of thing is really fascinating because for 100 years in America, it's just been this catch-all boogeyman that if you let too many immigrants in, you're communist. If you
workers' rights,
want to increase Medicaid, it's communist. Right. I even wrote for Vice recently about some online agitators who are trying to push MAGA communism, which is, these are theory nerds. These are like Marxist theory nerds, and they think we're going to sell MAGA communism to the MAGA crowd, and it's going to accelerate political. So this is to say communism isn't often about communist policy or even communist ideology or theory. What it means instead is it is the antithesis of the thing that affirms America's greatness and a certain kind of America.
Boom. That is
capitalist, hierarchical America, where, to me, this America that people dream of, that extremists dream of, equality isn't the goal. Individuality is. And that's what shapes these super incoherent views on the CCP and communism, because if you go to Shenzhen, you can be a money-loving, living it up capitalist and have a great time in China, but nobody wants to think about that. They are on Chan boards and on Telegram and stuff. They just talk about this like omnipotent evil. That,
it doesn't make sense. At this point, China has state-sponsored capitalism is how I refer to it, but it is definitely not a command economy anymore. So the idea that it is kind of absurd to me. On that note, I actually want to play a couple of videos so people understand what we're talking about. I know you've seen this. Let me explain it before I play some of this. But there has been a prevalent movement at every single Trump rally I've been at every single Proud Boy rally I've been at, that is anti-CCP. There is always a group there that have their anti-CCP signs. And there is always, and I swear to God, without fail, a car that drives around the rally with bullhorns coming out of it that constantly says anti-CCP repeatedly over and over again, dialogue that they project. So this is definitely a thing. I interviewed Andy Campbell, who is the author of We Are Proud Boys. He's the editor at Huffington Post. One of the things that he told me that I thought was super fascinating is he had researched where all of the GoFundMe donations were coming in for Proud Boys to for their legal defense, and a vast majority of it was coming from Chinese immigrants, which I thought was shocking.
Yes.
But
that's
here we are.
Something that shocked me as well. And hey, what better evidence of a legitimate Asian conservatism / reactionary movement, right?
Than that,
to take the enemy of my enemy is my friend to that degree.
Extreme.
You can only sort of distill it into one thing. You believe that America that you want is under attack from forces, and that any means are necessary to repel that quote unquote attack. right?
They think Biden and any sort of Democratic Party infrastructure is being infiltrated by the CCP. They actually, in fact, let's play this video. I have two videos. We can play them both, but I just so people can get an idea of what we're talking about if they haven't seen this before.
Good afternoon, America. This is Prince, and
this is Evelyn.
And we're from the new federal state of China. We're outside here at America Fest 2022 at Phoenix Convention Center. Today, more than 100 supporters from all around the world of New NFSC has shown up here to support our cause. And we're so honored to be invited by MFAX and by TPUSA to have two main stage speeches as well as two booths, 126 and 127 in the exhibition area. So we're the people of New Federal State of China, and our mission is to take down the evil Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you, Prince. Today we have met a lot of freedom-loving Americans and people from other countries to celebrate this huge event. And the people stay our booth and know about our mission, and most of all of them were amazed that what we are doing right now. They know that we're risking our life to take down the Chinese Communist Party and to stop the infiltration of America from by the Chinese government.
Take down the CCP! 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 Take down the CCP!
So, New Federal State of China is this thing that's out there now. I'm not sure who's funding them. I'm curious to know if anyone's doing work into trying to like peel the layers back on that onion. But it's this thing all of a sudden that is I think the natural outcome of this anti-CCP movement that we've seen kind of escalating for the last few years.
First of all, I just want to make a joke that's the weirdest Shenyun promotion I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Jokes aside, that's bizarre. That was a new one, the New Federal State of China. And what's bizarre about it, right, is that there are autonomous movements in China to increase democratic rights, to increase certain forms of representation, to free places like Xinjiang and Tibet. And this is not that. This is not even, hey, the CCP is failing to take care of the rural poor and our nationalist policies on that front have regressed.
Right.
It's not that. It's take down the CCP.
Yeah.
And
I think it's organically I think it's an organically 100% American. I do not think that this is a movement started in China that's come here to the United States. I think it's being funded by some right-wing extremists of some sort. But it's just wild that this is like it's increasing in a way, and it's you're right, it's incredibly reactionary, but it's also like, what is the end game of this?
And it swirls some competing facts, right? For instance, there are some big time, as you already know, protests in China against the CCP's policies regarding COVID. Right. And there are people right now, Chinese young people, who are coming out in support of those protests and saying, hey, the Chinese government needs to do things differently. But that is swirling with and adding to this other kind of communist discontent, which has very little to do with living conditions in China and very much to do, I think, with American hegemony.
I agree.
Down the
I
CCP.
agree. I agree. Because it's the biggest threat to the American empire, right? At this point, China is the biggest threat, economically, power-wise.
Sure.
Of course, yeah, I mean.
Sure. I mean, but, you know, what happens to the debt we owe China if the CCP goes? I mean, I'm starting to think of things in a more
That's a good
rational way.
question. I think the Chinese government probably holds more treasury bonds from the United States than anybody. So that is a valid question, honestly.
So, yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. And this is the same thing that, you know, down in Orange County, why would Congresswoman Michelle Steele red bait her Asian opponent as being a part of the communist machine? Have you no shame? And the answer these days is no. And honestly, the capacity for shame changes when the Overton window moves, when things become normalized and stuff like TPUSA conferences and things become breeding grounds for all kinds of weird ideologies, but especially grifts. And I don't want to dismiss NFSC without doing research as being a grift, but it smells of a grift, right? Because it's so opaque, its goals are so not transparent, and it's who are these people? What is their stake in it? And I've written a lot about the political grift and how that's almost the new political economy, right? It is these sort of various people, MAGA communist, acolytes, people who are just dirtbag sort of right-wingers in RVs going from rally to rally trying to make a buck on live streams, to people like, at the very top, folks like Tucker Carlson who have made institutional money off of this type of rhetoric. And so, here I am just shaking my head, somewhat annoyed and shocked, but not at all surprised.
It's wild.
Yes.
It's absolutely wild.
There is so much opportunity, not just politically, but economically, for people to make a living off of this rhetoric. And I think the fact that, I think there's actual research that shows the media literacy of folks who identify as conservative or right-wing, and the fact that, there's very little factual basis for a lot of these grievances. And our American system, our culture, our society, our education system is not built to fix this overnight. And, when people talk about how do we stop Asian hate crimes, I wrote a story called The Lingering Wounds of Anti-Asian Hate for Mel Magazine. And I spoke to two great people here in the Bay, Cynthia Choi, the head of Chinese for Affirmative Action, which is a progressive nonprofit, and Eddie Zhang, who is a community organizer and an advocate for underprivileged folks. He works a lot in the East Bay in Oakland. And both of them were saying, listen, we can't prosecute our way out of this. We are reaping the sins of American culture and society and political habit. And what that means is not only is an angry extremist right going to look for more targets, right? But they're also going to be recruiting the most discontented people who are a part of the group, Asians. You can either be a chink or some other slur and you're a commie, or you can be on the right side and you're a wholehearted American and you believe in democracy and all these sort of, stereotypes. And I think this will only continue to get more complicated because, again, I can't stress this enough. Asian American is not a monolith. It means...
No, it's definitely not. It's definitely not. I mean, I think of all the times I've seen at Trump rallies, Asian American individuals literally wearing these outfits that are like head to toe photos of Trump printed on fabric with American flags and like really extreme, right? And you're just like, wow. It's wild. But it's, again, all of this is reactionary. And I do think it's related to the economic things that underlie most of right-wing movements.
Right. And by the way, when progressive Asians advocate for things like critical race theory being legitimized and taught, it's because of experiences that many of us have had with family members, friends, older folks who have these very regressive takes, because especially if they were a part of the cohort like my parents were in the 1970s of coming through in a big immigration wave, leaving often war-torn nations. Korea was a mess, basically under a fascist dictatorship after the war. And America really does seem like heaven in a sense. And I think what is American hegemony? American hegemony is not merely its economic and militaristic strength or imperialistic might. It is also the mythology around America.
Huge, yes, the myth is huge.
And so to me, this is, we are seeing all kinds of people protect that myth, put their bodies on the line to maintain that myth, to trespass onto the Capitol in defense of that myth. And naturally, folks who came here in search of a better life, whether it's from Cuba, whether it's from Korea, whether it's from Vietnam, are going to think that way. And I don't mean to say that Asian extremism is becoming the next big thing. I actually think we're still underrepresented in that sort of political
100%. Yeah, I agree
very
with
much
you.
so. Yeah. But this is the start, right?
It's this is there's always a start.
Yeah, and this is perhaps the most American thing of all, is this, what does assimilation look like? Well, this is kind of what assimilation looks like.
This is what assimilation looks like. You know what's really fascinating to me, Eddie, is that a lot of the countries where these individuals, their families come from, whether they're first generation or second generation, whatnot, you know, like Japan has traditionally been a very ultra-nationalist government, right? I don't know if a lot of Americans know that. So I would consider that far right. They're ultra-nationalists. You know, Chinese government, communism, even with the state-sponsored capitalism is one-party rule. It's a bit authoritarian. So there are Malaysia, obviously. I mean, we can go down the list and see that there is a lot of, like Vietnam, the history there. There is a lot of authoritarian regimes. The Philippines, like, you know, that is kind of been predominantly the forms of government, whether they're right or left, they've taken some form of authoritarianism. So I wonder, like, so then you come to the United States and you're like, I want freedom. I believe in this myth of civil liberty and, you know, unbounded freedom, and that's what's attractive to me. And in order to get that thing, that myth that I believe exists and that I want, I'm willing to, like, destroy the democracy to get it. Like, I mean, there's sort of a weird irony to that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and you know, I just want to point out, often when you speak to folks who talk about these ideas, they don't see the contradictions, right?
No,
like
they
how,
don't.
For instance, like all the fervor over voter and election fraud.
Yeah.
You know, it's under the guise of saving democracy when you're actually trying to dismantle the elements of that process that make it democratic, like, you know, not forcing people to stand in a line all day. Like, so it's just.
Or preventing Biden from becoming the president. I mean, but I mean, that's the most authoritarian thing you could do, right? So it's wild. It's kind of.
And I've been to enough protests to know that really what I think we're seeing here is a lot of isolated people trying to find community, trying to find coherent meaning in lives that lack that. You know, I've struggled with depression. I've looked at my life and been like, why do I feel isolated? Why do I feel like we don't have rituals and social community and things that are easily accessible in that form? That's what has made me interested in politics and political circles and organizing. And unfortunately, I think it's just on a spectrum. And it's not strange to me at all that folks like Asian Proud Boys and things like that they relish in being different, in being not who they're supposed to be.
Not, and I think, as what the world perceives them to be, Right.
And I think that's a slightly different kind of discontent than our white peers who are in those same exact spaces, right? We know a lot about...
by design it's going to be, right? Because that is what white supremacy does to people, right? On the good and the bad side, you know what I mean? It just defines both of those things.
And so when you have Proud Boys like Enrique Tarrio saying, we're not racist, we accept people from every... I know that they accept people from everywhere. I mean, you know, we've seen enough Proud Boys
seen it,
colored
but that doesn't mean they're not racist.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It means that any means to an end is necessary. And sometimes that's that. But, you know, you talk to you read from the most extreme perspectives in extremist circles, and they're like, oh, everyone's just a pawn on the way to something else. You know, why does the far right have a snitching problem, have a rat problem? I wrote about that. And it's because these are often opportunists. And that is a huge differentiation between, you know, both sides, like, oh, the left Antifa. It's simply not the same.
It's not even remotely, the
same money, the same energy. It simply is not. So,
anti-fascists are not grifters at all, because most of the time they don't even want to be recognized or named. You know what I mean? They sort of want to work with their autonomy to have their goal, which is to defeat fascism. So they're very much different. You know, and I've had those conversations. I'm having another one of them that I spoke to in Beverly Hills was basically saying to me, listen, I know that racists exist. I know there are racists in the Trump organization. I know that Trump's a racist. He's like, I don't care. He's like, because you know why I don't care? He's like, there's also racism on the left. There are people in the Biden administration that are racist, which is all true, right? I don't just disacknowledge that. So his thing was like, I'm going to stand with the people that I politically agree with and not care about that aspect, because that aspect's going to be there no matter what.
Right.
That's a valid point.
Yeah, it's a valid point. And if you're seeking community, not ideological clarity, not a mission necessarily politically, other than take down this enemy. And that enemy could be a drag story time at a library. It could be randomly, like I reported on, randomly a protest at the Chinese embassy. Like,
that's wild, yeah.
That's an American representative.
Yeah.
It's not, what are you protesting? Like, so,
I don't know if they know.
So it's about vibes. So much of this is about vibes. It's about vibing in the right way and finding a sense of comfort.
Finding acceptance. Yeah, I think that's true. 100% true.
And that is not to downplay the tactical violence. Things like Governor Gretchen Whitmer trying to kidnap Whitmer. There are serious, dangerous people. There are murderers and killers and rapists who are extremists. But the vast majority, especially in the post-Trump era or the post-2016 era, are not quite that. And I think that's why, I was browsing Andrew Callahan's new the Channel 5 HBO documentary, This Place Rules, in which he just went around the country interviewing Q and MAGA and all of that. None of those people make sense.
No,
none of those people make sense.
They don't.
That's why we cringe and chuckle and why we watch that documentary on HBO is because
I haven't seen it yet. I'll have to check it out.
But there are serious harms, right? Like in one clip we see like a 9 or 10-year-old child just repeating talking points. He's homeschooled and he's isolated because none of his peers want to hear about how Joe Biden is a reptile. Oh my God. And so we see, instead of what I was hoping as someone in my 20s thinking, oh, Gen Z is going to change the world. It's never like that because we're all products of our upbringing and the society that we grow up in.
That's why change is slow.
Changed. That's why change is slow. Yeah. And unfortunately, that's going to be the trailing effects of this. Like, I'm privileged enough to not really be fearful of getting attacked by a white or Asian person who disagrees with me politically. What I am afraid of is the descendant of that thought, right? Whether that's a literal child or just their effect on their community, their families, the people around them.
That kid has no idea that that's false information. That's really tragic. It's tragic, really.
And even people who disagree are often put into this stalemate where they can't really do anything because they're worried about just further, further pushing a person away and disenfranchising them. I mean, it's such a complicated place to be in society.
It's psychologically very complicated,
Yeah, and I think that's why scholars are really looking at what needs to change structurally in the way that we're educated, in the way that we communicate with one another, in the way that we break out of echo chambers, especially online. I think that's where a lot of the sort of energy is being put into, and rightfully so, because I don't think we can just counter protest and police our way out of this, unfortunately. And I think both of those things do play a role, but especially I'm heartened to hear that more people are reporting hate crimes or hate incidents against them, and that's a good thing. People need to be aware of this rather than it happening and just going home and trying to forget about it. So, it's going to be a long road ahead.
It's going to be a long road ahead. Before we move on to the next topic, which is I want to look at some of the writing you've done with abortion and white supremacy. You're familiar with sovereign citizen
very much so.
Ideology.
There's no sense of what belongs to who, and to me that makes for a lot of chaos. It makes for a lot of theft, and it paves the way for tremendous violence. And we've seen that in every communist revolution that we've observed in history. There's always tremendous violence. There's genocide, often based on class. What they do is they foment a lot of hatred for anyone who happens to be successful. So it's built on greed and avarice, really. So, and I'm not saying there isn't greed and avarice in capitalism, because there certainly is. But at the very least in capitalism, transactions they're supposed to be voluntary. So we effectively believe that within the boundaries that are established by God, which is that we may not initiate force against the life, liberty, or property of anyone else. Within those boundaries, we should be allowed to do as we please as individuals. So with our own lives, with our own liberty, with our own property.
This seemed really counterintuitive to me at the time that anybody that came from the Asian culture would kind of jive with these beliefs. But a lot of it was, again, driven by anti-communist rhetoric. What are your thoughts on that? This is probably not a very common thing to see, I'm guessing.
No, it's not something that I've come across a lot. In fact, if within the topic of sovereign citizen movements, I think it's Black Americans that are maybe highly represented.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah. In fact, I wrote about a Portland family that was evading eviction, and they were doing so through increasing sort of sovereign citizen rhetoric, and had anti-fascists sort of occupying space and keeping police out of this eviction. Very weird swirl of things, but
that's
yeah. I mean, I think sovereign citizen movements are the most pure individualistic sort of reactionary anti-authoritarian tactic, and it is strange to hear about Asian folks going down that path, only because that implies a deep interest in American law and how to leverage it, almost always incorrectly, but and so I'm trying to think who would be attracted to that. Certainly, carving out your own space, your own jurisdiction is maybe the American dream, the most American dream of all. But it almost reminds me of how folks were trying to create autonomous zones in Seattle and things like that, more than necessarily.
Yeah, I guess it's the right-wing militia response on the other side to. Yeah, I gotcha.
Yeah, and so but again, as soon as you start going down, if you declare yourself a sovereign citizen or you're interested, all of a sudden, boom, automatically you're within a community, a very niche community. Right. And I think there is power and agency that comes from that decision. Okay. Because legally and financially, I don't think it's worth the trouble for most people to leverage the sovereign citizen thing. It's very complicated.
To me, it doesn't make sense because, especially if you're somebody that believes, if you're super right-wing, it makes sense to me. But if you're somebody that believes in leftist ideals such as the common good, it doesn't make sense. The reason you pay taxes is because that money goes into funding the fire department, paved roads, libraries, things of that nature. And these guys don't think they should have to pay any taxes to the government, or there's no, common public goods.
Yeah, well, and I will say, Tina, I think maybe one of the counterpoints is that sometimes there is kind of a land back or reparations take to sovereign citizen movements.
I have not seen that. Interesting.
Yeah, I think within the Black sovereign citizen movement, that is often the case. It is a wrestling back of control and agency. And I think it's partly inspired by, perhaps the oldest autonomous movement in terms of Native American reservation lands and things like that, although the history around that is very tragic, of course. I think there is at least this idea that it's almost
interesting.
To me, that
makes more sense to me than this Ruby Ridge kind of mentality, but okay.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
All with the Bundys, that's also a similar thing, right? Hey, these are my cattle, they're on BLM lands, but that's mine, you can't mess with it type of attitude.
Right.
It does kind of, yeah, to me, it is a vision of like old America, like 1700s, like 1800s type of America. It's that sort of vision. And, it's funny because I've heard that strategy applied to so many political niches, including like incels who want to create like a new territory just for other incels, where women can be invited, but,
and be slaves. Agree to be raped.
Yeah. Right. And so it's it's like this little template that you can place on top of a lot of political ideologies, where someone gets to the breaking point and they're like, you know what, screw it. I'm just not going to participate in American infrastructure anymore. It's like going off the grid, except you refuse to pay taxes and then get audited by the IRS in a very painful, years-long process.
Exactly. Not my idea of a good time. So on that note, I want to turn towards white supremacists and their obsession with abortion and fertility rates, right? So this is definitely a thing. It sort of ties back into the idea of white replacement theory, right? The reason that a lot of the neo-Nazis out there are against abortion is because they don't think white women are having enough white children, and they want to encourage that, right? They think white women need to have like 20 times more babies than they already are having. So you wrote two pieces that I thought were both very good. The first one I want to put up is white supremacists like the Buffalo shooter are obsessed with fertility. This is an angle I don't think a lot of folks have considered, because this goes beyond just the abortion. This is the actual fertility, right? So the Buffalo shooter talked up birth rates and demographic shifts as key indicators of the replacement of whites in America. It's an old trope wielded by right-wing America since the turn of the 20th century, and it's become a powerful meme to justify violence today. If there's one thing I want you to get from these writings, it's that white birth rates must change. That's from his manifesto.
Yeah.
So reads the first line of the Buffalo shooter's rambling 180-page message to the world. Much of it was plagiarized from previous mass shooter manifestos, and though many portions of the document, through many of the portions of the document, 18-year-old Peyton Gendron obsesses over women and their fertility, regurgitating right-wing talking points about the loss of white supremacy as other races fill in America. So that was the first piece. I want to talk about that first, and then we'll turn to the other one on abortion. It's a common theme. Yeah. We've seen it. They're convinced that, part of the problem I have with their rhetoric is in their mind's eye, all white women agree with them, right?
Yes.
We all, none of us are dating people outside of the white race, which is insane.
That's right.
and we all want to just have white babies. And the reason we're not doing that is because we're not staying at home. We're out working instead or whatnot. So what are some of the thoughts you had when you were writing this?
To me, it's so interesting how so much of white discontent in this country is evidenced as boiling down to the perception of scarcity. They are losing something. And that's what's so powerful about the hegemony, right? Like it's a big fancy word used by leftists and all that. But what it really talks about is why is there dominance of a culture and of a group? And what mythologies maintain that? And so this fear that there's loss of speech rights, there's loss of protection from police, there's loss of fertility and white children. It all comes from, I think, a long-standing insecurity. And we saw that, again, we saw that after Reconstruction. We saw that after Jim Crow laws fell. And most recently, it became a fight when schools were forced to be desegregated. And the Christian right saw what was happening, and they were like, oh, like, no. Like, we have to put our foot in somehow. And which is why the anti-abortion debate first got started in the 60s. I mean, Christians were not all that upset about abortion till that point.
No, they weren't at all. And in fact, Catholic Church actually supported abortion. If there's a great documentary on this called Reversing Roe, if anyone has an interest in that. You're right. It was not the thing that it is today.
Right. And so we see an example of how civil rights advancement led to a need to desegregate schools, which led to perceived scarcity of white spaces, white education, all of that. And so, to create abortion as a wedge issue makes a lot of sense. And to tie it back to fertility, it makes a lot of sense because it's not the thing, it's a thing that is a part of the argument.
Right.
It's never just about fertility. It's never just about immigration. It's never just about the harms of minority representation. It's the same thing when men seem to be upset that a woman was going to be a ref in the NFL. Remember that argument years ago when the first female referee in the NFL, and some people made it out to be a decline in the sport or the loss of jobs for men, if that was ever the issue in the NFL. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So, scarcity. And I've been trying to think about how scarcity affects all of the political discourse and turmoil in this country. But yeah, I mean, the obsession with
it's false scarcity often.
False scarcity, exactly. I think declining birth rates are a concern insofar as that many modern Western democracies seem to be struggling in terms of the future of that. For me personally, I think it's more about young people facing huge
they can't afford to have
challenges
kids.
in terms of in terms of wealth and the lack of generational wealth and all of that. But when it feels like something is going wrong, a lot of people will take a big idea and just repeat it. Things become memes. And I think the loss of the white race because of declining birth rates is one of those memes that is just so common, so spammed across so many different groups, incel groups, white, sort of white hate groups, various, even multiracial extremist groups like the Proud Boys still often buy into this type of thing, and they blame all forms of societal change for that happening. Is it the queerification of America that's doing this? Is it critical race theory and people wanting to marry outside their race? Like, that doesn't even make sense. What are the connections really? But when you feel like you're under attack, you're going to push back somehow. And I think this is another way, and that's why I say when someone like that young man goes on that mass killing and writes white birth rates must change in his manifesto, I mean, does that really explain what pushed him to that point? No, it doesn't. What it explains is that they were subsumed in an online culture, most likely, that was memeing the hell out of that point. And there's, a lot of scholarship around radicalization and rabbit holes and red pilling. But, all those points still stand. And I think what's going to be the next thing, Tina? What do you think? I mean, I'm trying to think. Will we circle back to the border issue? Will we?
That's never going to go away. So it's interesting to me because I think what's happening, and I think you're hitting on this when you're talking about the Proud Boys, even they're a multicultural organization. What they're complaining about, they're not going to say it's the decline of white civilization. They're saying it's the decline of Western civilization, right? That's a word play as far as I'm concerned, because the implication of that is white civilization, right? So when we say Western civilization, we mean white, because we're talking about European nations that went and conquered other places, right, in search of empire. I also think it's really disturbing that this idea that, okay, so, we've now decoded the human genome. We all know that race is biologically vacuous. It's not really a thing. So the things that define race at this point are cultural. Like, what are the cultural norms? And I don't think that those fairly or adequately describe race either, in the sense, because if you are from Sweden, per se, Sweden is very multicultural. It's not just white folks. The cultural norms there in Sweden transcend race, right? It's about being Swedish. Like, we celebrate, Midsummer, because Midsummer is a Swedish cultural celebration, right? It's got nothing to do with race. Whereas you go to other parts of the globe. Now, is it the case if you've been in a very hegemonic society that everybody in that society is the same race and they all celebrate that culture together? Yes, that's possible too. But I think that as people intermarry, for example, that starts to go away as well. It's not just the genetic alleles that sort of spread out, right? So, and I do think that circles back to scarcity. I agree with you. I think that's exactly, it's perceived panic over a loss. And I do think that perceived panic would be far less if there was less income inequality. I think the big driver of all of this truly is income inequality. Yeah.
And I can't help but make parallels again to incels. There was a study that I wrote about that correlated incel speech and expression online with widening income inequality gaps on the ground, perceived loss of community spaces, so on and so forth. So I mean, look at Korea again. South Korea, sometimes a dream in the minds of some extremists as a nation that seems to have its stuff together, but actually South Korea very much does not, because of horrible, crushing wealth inequality, especially for younger generations. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing a huge anti-feminist movement, a big incel movement, a lot of sort of desperation around, I don't have any prospects professionally and I don't have them sexually either because of that. Although a lot of that, again, is false scarcity. And sometimes very real scarcity in terms of, if people are like depressed and not working, well, they're not going to go out as much either. But
yeah, they're not going to go out as much. And also the way that they come across to women, it can be really problematic, and they don't want to sort of address that. Maybe these guys, if they stopped for a second and thought like, oh, being really mean and abusive towards a woman isn't going to get me laid. They don't seem to realize that. They worship guys like, Andrew Tate, who's been in the news, who are telling them, yes, manipulate young women, hit them, rape them. It's fine. That's how you get what you want from them. Like, no, that's not. That is absolutely not the case. But that's the messaging that they're hearing.
Right. And the even more nuanced messaging is, hey, even if you don't want to do those things, progressive culture has gone too far. We need to bring back common sense and hierarchy to the way that people relate to one another. So that's the strange thing, is that so much of what we've been talking about on this podcast is a distinctly American expression of political turmoil. However, aspects of that at the core, at the foundation, are happening all across the world in Western-style democracies. And it's really creating a lot of the same patterns in terms of male discontent in the hegemonic demographic, and how the internet thing leads those folks into very, very defined niche rabbit holes, where they can come to a certain kind of potentially violent conclusion about what needs to change in the world. And that's why, January 6th is such an American thing, and yet it's not. It's not. I think that's why so much of what I would like to see, even in terms of the media coverage around this, is looking at, well, what patterns are we reliving right now? What did happen after Reconstruction? What did happen after minority groups gained agency in big ways? What happened after minority groups got visibility in big ways? Like, how did
this isn't our first time at the rodeo, right? We've been through these cycles.
Even in World War II, how did Japanese internment
100%.
affect hate crimes and demonization of people who were not interned and other Asians? I mean, it's just...
there was, after World War II in this country, the United States of America, I don't know, a lot of folks realize this, we had very robust right-wing extremist movements happening, whether it was the German Bund, whether it was the Christian Front, which was very, very much right-wing militia group. So, I mean, we've sort of lived through this. I don't think it's necessarily worse now than it was then. It feels worse now because we're living through it, right? Yeah. But there's definitely been cycles of this in the United States.
Yeah, and to tie it all back, I do think what is kind of unique about our conversation today is, I think because of the lack of political visibility for many Asian American communities and Asian immigrant communities so far, I think it is almost kind of a canary in the coal mine type of a metaphor at play here, because I think what we see in terms of Asian extremism, Asian reactionary thought, a new Asian conservatism movement, including in places that are quote unquote liberal heavens like San Francisco. I think that is demonstrating what American society and what culture and American politics today, what kind of emotions and tactics that they're inspiring, right? And this is why I'm also very critical of the Democratic Party, because they've missed opportunities to really put a foot down in the ground and say, we're going to sort of re-steer the direction of the narrative, of the rhetoric. But instead, we're just caught in this sort of two-party Pong game, while folks who are disenfranchised by both mainstream parties are finding new ways to express and new ways to be violent, both physically and rhetorically and emotionally. So, I mean, obviously a lot of lack of leadership from the Republican Party when it comes to these sort of fascist and fascist-light ideas and figures, but certainly not the kind of pushback that we, many of us wanted from the Democratic Party.
I agree.
You may know this, but the Dems funded many extremist candidates across the country in an attempt to destabilize Republican.
Pied Piper, They really believe that.
And hey, if someone told me that works, then okay, I would nod along. But
it doesn't work, though.
What is the rhetorical harm of
they don't care? There's that too.
Funding?
Yeah, there is
so-
rhetorical harm that comes from moving that Overton window. You're 100% correct on that. But they stupidly also believe that these people were unelectable because they can't read the room.
Yeah.
They don't see where we are.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
we see the trickle down of political decisions and the way that our political economy is taught, is consumed, and is sold. And we see now that it's like brought a community that once was not on the political fringe very much into the political fringe, right? And so, not to tokenize Asians as the canary in the coal mine, but from my perspective, it is kind of like that metaphor.
Indeed. We sort of touched on this. There was a second article, the anti-abortion movement was always about a race war.
Yeah.
I think this is true. So I want to throw that up really quickly. The debate about the rights of a pregnant person and an unborn fetus has raged for decades, but the origin of the American anti-abortion movement wasn't built in good faith. Instead, it relied on right-wing organizing around fears of white extinction, which continues to fuel the anti-choice rage that we see today. I agree with you on this. I think it drives a lot of, the religious right as well.
Yeah, and I think later on in the article I mentioned, some of the words and actions of the biggest leaders in this conservative religious movement say it all. Jerry Falwell, very, very famous. He claimed later that opposing abortion inspired his religious career, but in reality, he didn't even deliver a sermon on the topic until more than 5 years after Roe versus Wade had passed, according to a historian. And his close friend and ally, Paul Weyrich, basically said the quiet part out loud when he said, quote, "What galvanized the Christian community was not abortion, school prayer, or the Equal Rights Amendment. What changed their minds was Jimmy Carter's intervention against Christian schools, trying to deny them tax-exempt status on the base of so-called de facto segregation," is what he said in an interview. So that's Paul Weyrich, sort of a big figure in the moral majority / sort of new Christian right campaign that started in the late 1970s. And that, along with the moral influence of Ronald Reagan,
huge.
who is still celebrated as the father of the pro-life movement. I mean, this was really a ripe time for conservatives to stoke growing fears about rising sexual, social, economic liberation of women, and portraying abortion rights as a symptom of how America was going wrong. So you hear all the same things, the themes of change, of scarcity, of loss, of perceived loss, and how status quo America was supposed to be the ideal. Given that these were folks who were fighting against civil rights in various ways, I don't know how true we should, view that, but that's exactly how the escalation happened. You have top-down rhetoric that influences, even the KKK by 1985 was in on this thing that they had never, ever cared about before, ever. And they were putting up wanted signs for, asking for personal information of abortion providers and stuff like that. So you see immediately, within 10 years, the escalation of rhetoric and potential for violence.
Indeed.
And that's why when I talk about things in good faith and in bad faith, I like to use that framing in some of my op-eds and writings, because I think conservatism is not inherently bad faith. I would be okay with the existence of an American conservative movement that was basing its rhetoric on evidence and scholarship and with good faith interaction and debate with the other side. But unfortunately, I think what we've seen right now is a regression of politics where everything is kind of a money-making opportunity and anything goes if you can attempt to get the final outcome that you want. And so something like this, like the new Christian right in the 1970s and 80s, working in bad faith to gin up tempers and panic about abortion and about the corrosion of American society at a time when America was becoming the most successful, most capitalist, most rich nation in the world. It's just a little bit bizarre, right? It doesn't it doesn't make sense in the way that some of us want it to, but I think that's by design. I think
Right.
the smoke and mirrors is always by design when it comes to this kind of extremism and this corner of conservatism, which has now become far more than a corner. It's become the landscape.
Yeah, it's quickly definitely becoming the landscape. Eddie, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me today. A really informative conversation. And I also want to ask you what's the best place for people to find your work? I know Mail Magazine, but your Twitter, wherever else you think is a good place for them to look you up.
Thank you so much for having me, Tina. This was a wide-ranging and honestly, really thoughtful conversation, even for me to walk through as I'm writing an academic journal article on actually rising reactionary politics in Asian communities. So
awesome, perfect.
You can find more of my stuff. I'm still on Twitter, still hanging on.
I'm still hanging on too.
So yeah, Eddie Kim X, EDDIEKIMX. People can reach out to me also on my website, eddiekim.net. If you want to reach out or talk about some other things, please feel free to reach out to me. But yeah, if I were just to say one last thing before we go, I think look at strategy and tactics and how much they differ from the actual thing that's happening on the ground. And that's not disjointed because things are foolish and clumsy and not done right, although that's part of it. It's also by design in a way to sort of serve as a misdirection from what people are really wanting. And I think at the core is that inequality and loss of community, that there's been reams and reams and reams of material written about this. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to keep thinking about that after this talk, but thank you very much for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eddie.